Upper Genesee Valley, New York, September 1872. The air held the first crisp promise of autumn, a warning woven into the gold of the turning leaves. Along the river, where the old grist mill stood silent, its great wheel locked in decay, a solitary man worked. Matthias Rainer, newly arrived from the Austrian Tyrol, was patching the mortar of the abandoned stone structure. He worked with a quiet, methodical rhythm that drew the eyes and the scorn of his neighbors. Joel Merrick, foreman of the valley's only sawmill and a man whose opinions were as solid as the oak he milled, pulled his wagon to a stop on the road above. He watched for a long moment, his face a mask of disbelief. He called down, his voice carrying easily in the still air, "Rainer, what in God's name are you doing? That's a tomb, not a house." Matthias paused, looked up, and wiped a smear of lime mortar from his hand. "I am making it a house, Mr. Merrick." Merrick spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "You're wasting your time. That stone will suck every bit of heat you make. It's a damp ruin, fit for raccoons and nothing else. No family can heat it." He gestured with his thumb toward the woods. "You should be putting up a proper cabin before the snow flies." From his perch on the wagon, another farmer, Silas Croft, chimed in. "Merrick's right, Austrian. That thing will sweat ice on the inside come January. We all know it. It's a fool's errand." The word hung in the air. Foolish. It was the consensus of the valley. For weeks, the strange immigrant chipping away at the derelict mill had been the primary source of local amusement. They watched him haul buckets of sand from the riverbank, saw the slow burn of his lime pit, and shook their heads. He was the Austrian madman trying to live in a pile of rocks. What did this Tyrolean millwright, a man who understood the subtle dance of gears and the flow of air, know about surviving a New York winter that a valley of seasoned, axe-wielding frontiersmen had missed? The story of how he answered that question is more than a tale of survival. It's a lesson in physics written in stone and still air. If you stay with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle that separates a shelter that fights the cold from one that simply ignores it. It's a principle that modern building science has only recently rediscovered. Subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comments what you think is the most important feature for a winter home. Matthias Rainer was not a carpenter, he was not a stonemason, and he certainly was not a frontiersman in the American mold. He was a miller, a millwright, from the steep, windy valleys of Tyrol. His hands knew the heft of a cogwheel, the precise tolerance of a bearing, the smooth, cool feel of a well-dressed millstone. His life had been a study of systems in motion, of water turning wheels, of stones grinding grain, and most importantly, of air moving dust. In the enclosed, powerful world of a grist mill, an uncontrolled draft was more than an annoyance. It was a thief that stole the fine, valuable flour straight out of the air. He had spent 20 years learning how to seal a building not against the cold, but against the air that carried it. He had come to America with his wife Annalise and their two small children, Lucas and Sophie, seeking land and opportunity. What they found in their first year was a brutal education in the physics of cold. They had built a standard log cabin, just as their neighbors advised. They had felled the trees, notched the logs, and chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud and moss. It looked sturdy. It felt American. But the winter of 1871 had nearly broken them. The cold did not stay outside. It seeped. It crept. It flowed into their lives until it became a permanent, malevolent presence. Annalise would wake in the pre-dawn dark to find the ropes of their bed frames stiff with frozen condensation. The water basin on the washstand, mere feet from the sleeping family, would be filmed with a white sheet of ice each morning. Mealtimes were the worst. They would huddle around the small iron stove, which glowed a dull red, yet the heat felt thin, phantom-like. As they ate their meager soup, the steam from their bowls would rise and mingle with the ghostly plumes of their own breath, each exhalation a visible reminder of the cold that owned the room. Lucas developed a deep, rattling cough that lingered for months. Sophie's fingers were perpetually blue. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, the roaring fire seeming to do little more than feed the insatiable hunger of the drafts. Matthias knew he had to do something different. He did not have the money for another cabin, but the abandoned mill, with its thick, solid walls, was available for the price of the back taxes. To everyone else, it was a ruin. To Matthias, it was a foundation. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a failure of materials. The logs were thick, the chinking was plentiful. The failure was one of conception. The settlers of the Genesee Valley saw cold as a force, a thing that pushed its way in. They believed the solution was a bigger fire, a brute force counterattack measured in cords of wood. The problem wasn't the cold pushing in. The problem was the house actively pulling it in. The physics were simple and deadly. A log cabin, with its dozens of seams and unsealed joints, was not a sealed box. It was a chimney laid on its side. When a fire was lit inside, the hot air expanded and rose, creating a pocket of low pressure at the bottom of the room. The laws of nature despise a vacuum. To equalize that pressure, cold, dense outside air would force its way in through every available crack, the gap under the door, the loose-fitting window sash, the hundreds of tiny imperfections in the chinking. This process is called convection. The very fire meant to provide warmth was powering an engine of its own destruction, creating a continuous, invisible river of frigid air that flowed across the floor, chilled the inhabitants, and was then heated, only to escape through the chimney or the gaps in the roof. You could see the evidence everywhere. A candle placed on the floor would flicker violently, its flame bent sideways by the draft. Women stuffed rags and corn husks into the cracks around windows, a futile gesture against a force as relentless as gravity. Families like the Crofts and the Merricks would burn a cord of prime hardwood a week, a staggering amount of labor, just to keep their indoor temperature from dropping into the 20s on the coldest nights. They were not heating their homes, they were attempting to heat the entire state of New York, 1 cubic foot of freezing air at a time. The heat they generated was lost almost as fast as it was produced, carried away on the relentless conveyor belt of convection. Matthias, having watched the fine dust of flour behave the exact same way in his old mill, understood this process intimately. He knew you couldn't defeat a river by boiling it. You had to dam it. His work on the mill began not on the outside, but on the inside. He ignored the crumbling mortar on the exterior face of the stone. That wasn't his problem. His war was with the air inside. Using salvaged wood, he began fastening thin strips of lath to the interior surface of the 2-foot-thick stone walls, leaving a gap of about 2 inches. He then mixed a massive quantity of lime plaster, a craft he'd learned for repairing mill interiors. It was slow, arduous work. Day after day, he troweled the thick, sticky plaster onto the lath, building up a smooth, seamless new wall inside the old one. Joel Merrick stopped by again in early October, this time on foot. He peered into the gloomy interior, his expression shifting from skepticism to outright pity. "Raynor, I tried to tell you," he said, his voice softer now, as if speaking to a sick child. "You're making a plaster wall. The damp from that stone will turn it to mush by spring. It'll peel right off." "The damp will stay in the stone," Matthias said, not looking up from his work. "The stone will not touch us." "But the cold will," Merrick insisted. "That air you're trapping in there, It'll be just as cold as the rock. It's useless. Air that does not move cannot steal heat, Matthias replied, pressing a final swath of plaster smooth. The conversation took a practical turn a week later. Matthias, his interior plaster shell complete, went to Merrick's sawmill. He needed dressed lumber, tongue and groove boards to create a final, warm interior surface and to build partitions for rooms. Merrick stood with his arms crossed, a plume of steam rising from his coffee mug in the chilled morning air. "Matthias, I can't in good conscience sell you my best boards for this," he said, shaking his head. "You're throwing good money into a stone pit. I'm not going to be the man who helped you build your family's sick room. The answer is no." He turned and walked away, effectively cutting Matthias off from the valley's primary source of building materials. The rejection was a blow, but it didn't stop him. Matthias spent the next 2 weeks painstakingly milling his own rough boards with a pit saw and the help of his wife, a brutal, exhausting task. The boards were uneven and ugly, but they were functional. He paneled the interior, creating his final barrier. Then he started on the entrance. To the locals, this was the most bizarre construction of all. He built a small, crude-looking box around the main door, about 6 feet square, with its own flimsy-looking outer door. It was an eyesore tacked onto the front of the stately old mill. Silas Croft, passing by, laughed out loud. "He's built a shed for his shed," he yelled to his companion. Annalise watched him hang the second door, her brow furrowed with a practical concern. "It is not beautiful, Matthias," she said quietly, her German accent soft. He paused, resting a hand on the rough wood of the new doorframe. "It does not need to be beautiful, Liebling," he answered. "It needs to be still." This was his two-pronged attack on convection. The house was no longer a single-line defense against the cold. It was a system. The core of Matthias's strategy was his understanding of air. To his neighbors, air was nothing, an empty space between the walls of a house and the wilderness outside. To Matthias, air was a substance, a fluid with properties as real as water or stone. It could hold heat, and it could move heat. The secret was to control its movement. His first innovation, the interior plaster wall, created a 2-inch gap of sealed, unmoving air. This is what Merrick and the others failed to grasp. They thought of it as trapping cold, but Matthias was trapping stillness. Heat moves through air in 3 ways: radiation, conduction, and convection. On the frontier, convection, the movement of heated air, was the great enemy, responsible for up to 70% of all heat loss in a standard cabin. A solid stone wall is a powerful conductor. Its immense thermal mass acts like a heat sink, constantly pulling warmth out of the living space. By placing an air gap between his family and the stone, Matthias installed a break. The stone wall would still become brutally cold. Its outer surface might be 0 degrees Fahrenheit, but that cold would have to conduct through the stone, then radiate across the 2-inch air gap, and finally conduct through the plaster and wood wall. The most important transfer method, however, was broken. Because the air in the gap was sealed, it could not form a convective loop. It could not rise when warmed by the inner wall and fall when cooled by the outer wall, creating a miniature heat-stealing engine within the wall itself. The air, unable to move, became a surprisingly effective insulator. The inner wall was not fighting the full thermal mass of the 2-foot stone wall. It was only facing a thin layer of still air. The family would only have to heat the air inside their plaster and wood bubble. His second innovation, the double-doored vestibule, was a direct assault on the other great source of convective loss: infiltration. Every time a person entered or left a conventional cabin, they exchanged a massive volume of air. A door swinging open for just 5 seconds could replace a quarter of the heated air in a small cabin with a blast of Arctic cold. It created a pressure shock that took the fire 10 minutes to overcome. Matthias's vestibule, what we would now call an airlock or an Arctic entry, solved this elegantly. To enter the Rainer home, you first opened the outer door and stepped into the small, unheated chamber. You then closed the outer door behind you, trapping a 6 by 6 foot bubble of outside air. Only then did you open the inner door to the house. Instead of a gale, only a small, manageable pillow of cold air would enter the living space. The vast pressure difference between the warm interior and the cold exterior was equalized in 2 small, controlled steps, instead of one catastrophic rush. It was a simple, almost laughably crude-looking device, but it was a perfect piece of thermal engineering. Matthias hadn't just built a better wall. He had built a house that understood and respected the unyielding laws of thermodynamics. That November, the winter arrived not as a slow decline, but as an assault. The locals called it a knife-wind winter. The temperature was not the primary enemy, it was the wind, a relentless, scouring force from the northwest that seemed to find every crack and flaw in a man's construction. For 17 nights that winter, the mercury in the valley's official thermometer would drop below 0, but the wind made it feel like 30 below. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a season of misery. The wind moaned through the log walls. It forced fine, stinging powder snow through the chinking. In Joel Merrick's well-built home, his wife hung heavy quilts over the doors and windows, but the drafts still made the candle flames dance and gutter. They kept the stove roaring, a hungry beast that consumed a huge stack of split oak every 2 days. Still, the floor remained so cold that his children had to stay perched on chairs or beds, their feet wrapped in wool. Sickness spread through the valley, a plague of coughs and fevers born of chilling drafts and huddled, damp living. In the old stone mill, there was silence. Outside, the knife wind shrieked around the stone corners, a sound like a hungry predator. But inside the Rainers' living space, the air was profoundly, unnervingly still. A candle on the dinner table burned with a tall, placid, unwavering flame. Matthias had not defeated the wind. He had simply made his home deaf to it. The contrast between their life and their neighbors was stark, measured in the small details of domesticity. One evening, Annalise, baking bread, left a small pat of butter on the wooden kitchen table, 10 feet from the stove. She forgot about it until the next morning. In any other house in the valley, it would have been a rock-hard, frozen lump. Here, it was still soft enough to spread. Lucas and Sophie, free from the tyranny of the cold floor, would lie on a bearskin rug, drawing on their slates for hours. They were not clustered around the fire. The entire living space was their domain. Their comfort was proven not by a thermometer, but by its own normalcy. They were simply living. The numbers told the most dramatic story. While Merrick burned through a cord of wood every 9 or 10 days, Matthias found that a single cord lasted him more than a month. His small stove, fed with a few logs at a time, kept the interior at a stable and comfortable 65 degrees, even when the temperature outside was 5 below 0. The great cold mass of the stone walls, separated from their living space by that simple 2-inch gap of air, had become irrelevant. It was a fortress wall whose siege could not reach the citadel within. Outside, the wind scoured the landscape into sharp, frozen waves of snow. Inside, a delicate spider's web in the corner of a deep-set window pane, a relic from the autumn, hung perfectly motionless, day after day, a fragile testament to the stillness. The day of vindication came in mid-January, during the winter's most brutal cold snap. The wind had been howling for 3 straight days, and the temperature had not risen above 0. Joel Merrick found himself in a bind. The large flour scale at his sawmill had broken, and he urgently needed another to weigh out feed for his livestock, who were beginning to suffer. He remembered that the old grist mill had a heavy-duty scale, a cast-iron relic from its working days. He knew Matthias Rayner had no use for it. He also knew, with a sinking feeling of guilt, that he had to go ask the man he had scorned and refused. He bundled himself in his heaviest coat and scarf and set out, dreading the visit. He imagined finding the family huddled in a single room, sick and freezing, a scene that would force him to offer charity he knew they would be too proud to accept. The walk to the mill was a battle. The wind tore at him, stinging his exposed cheeks and forcing its way through the seams of his clothing. When he reached the mill, he pushed open the crude outer door of Matthias's vestibule and stepped inside. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. The roaring of the wind vanished, replaced by a muffled silence. The air in the tiny chamber was cold, but it was dead, still air. It didn't bite. He stood there for a moment, stamping the snow from his boots, catching his breath, disoriented by the sudden peace. He knocked on the heavy inner door. It was opened by Matthias. Merrick braced himself for the blast of frigid, damp air he knew must come from a stone building in this weather. Instead, he was met by a gentle wave of neutral, still air. It wasn't hot, just calm. He stepped inside the main room. The sensory shock stopped him in his tracks. His face, raw and burning from the wind, expected the familiar, penetrating chill of a winter cabin. Instead, he felt nothing. No drafts on his neck, no cold currents swirling around his ankles. The air was warm, but it was the profound stillness that was so alien. He looked around. Annalise was sewing at a table. The two children were playing quietly on the floor. The room was lit by the calm, even light of two oil lamps, their flames as steady as if they were under glass bell jars. His gaze fell upon the deep-set windowsill. There sat a simple, unpainted tin cup. Merrick knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who had survived 40 such winters, what that meant. Any metal object left near a window in this cold should be covered in a thick white armor of frost. Any water left in it would be a solid block of ice. It was a law of nature. He walked over to it, drawn by a disbelief so strong it felt like a physical force. He reached out a gloved hand and hesitated. Then, he pulled off his glove and touched the metal with his bare fingers. It was cool, but it was just metal. There was no frost. He picked it up. It wasn't frozen to the sill. He gave it a little shake. Inside, water sloshed, liquid. The sight of that liquid water in that cup, on that windowsill, on this day, broke something in Joel Merrick's mind. It was a quiet, undeniable miracle that defied everything he knew. All his experience, all his certainty, evaporated in that small, sloshing sound. He turned to Matthias, the tin cup still in his hand. He was speechless for a long moment. "Matthias!" he began, his voice raspy. "How?" Matthias simply gestured to the walls, the door. "The house does not fight the wind," he said. "It does not feel it." Merrick looked from the placid children to the steady candle flame to the impossible cup in his hand. He finally understood. The Austrian hadn't been building a foolish house. He had been building a different reality. Merrick shook his head in slow, dawning awe. "You didn't build a house," he said, the words forming slowly, filled with reverence. "You built a bubble of summer." Joel Merrick left the mill that day with his flour scale, but also with a story. He did not whisper it. He proclaimed it. He, the valley's foremost skeptic, became Matthias Rayner's most fervent advocate. He described the still air, the warm floor, and most of all, the tin cup of water on the windowsill. The story was so improbable that people had to see for themselves. After the worst of the winter broke in March, the local preacher, Reverend Albright, organized a visit. He arrived with a few men from the church vestry, ostensibly to check on the welfare of the immigrant family, but really to satisfy their own curiosity. They experienced the same sequence of shocks as Merrick: the sudden peace of the vestibule, the calm warmth of the interior, the absence of drafts. They saw Sophie and Lucas, healthier and more robust than any children in the valley. They understood. That spring, a quiet revolution in building practices began. With lumber donated and delivered by a deeply humbled Joel Merrick, church crews built 6 small, ugly vestibules, Rainer boxes, they were called, onto the draftiest cabins in the settlement. It wasn't a full retrofit, but it was a start. The families who got them reported an immediate, dramatic increase in comfort and a significant reduction in firewood consumption the following winter. The idea spread. Knowledge, on the frontier, didn't travel by paper, it traveled by demonstration. Matthias Rainer's proof was unassailable. It was warm. What Matthias Rainer achieved through intuition and experience, modern building science would later formalize with complex equations and terminology. His sealed air gap was a primitive but highly effective version of a modern insulated wall assembly designed to create a complete thermal envelope. His obsessive focus on stopping air movement anticipated the modern concept of air tightness, now recognized as the single most critical factor in creating an energy-efficient building. His simple vestibule is now a standard, an often required architectural feature in cold climates, sometimes called an Arctic entry or a mudroom, but its function as an airlock remains unchanged. He was a century ahead of his time, a man who saw a home not as a collection of walls, but as a complete thermodynamic system. The other settlers in the Genesee Valley saw winter as an enemy to be fought. Their entire strategy was based on overpowering the cold with a bigger, hotter fire. It was a war of brute force, a loud, smoky, and deeply inefficient battle they were destined to lose every night, only to begin again the next day. They believed warmth was a product of addition. Matthias Rainer, the quiet millwright, understood a more profound truth. He saw the air not as an enemy, but as a medium, a restless element that had to be calmed. He knew that true, lasting warmth was not about adding more heat, but about ceasing to lose the heat you already had. His house didn't shout its defiance at the winter wind with a roaring fire. It achieved a state of grace through stillness. It stopped fighting its own air. Warmth, he proved, with a simple plaster wall and a crude wooden box, doesn't begin with the fire you build. It begins when the house, finally at peace with itself, decides to hold on to it. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like it. And tell us in the comments, what simple, clever solution from the past do you think deserves to be better known today? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical building practices and scientific principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. Any application of historical techniques to modern structures should be undertaken only after consultation with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.